Good evening. How's everyone doing? Good to see everybody, and we got a few visitors. It's good to have some visitors. We've had good classes this week, and I told Jeff when we got here, I told him he did a good job last night, and following them guys, the preacher class is making me feel a little nervous trying to keep up. So hopefully we have a good class. But tonight we're looking at the animals that were on the ark and how God saved the animals along with Noah and replenished the earth. And got a lot of information, so I don't want to be like Eddie and run over and have people come up here and push him out of the way. So we'll just jump in and get started. What does the Scripture tell us about the animals that were brought onto the ark, or how many animals? All right, 2 of each? All right, and 7 of the clean. And so in Genesis 6, 19 through 20, God said, "And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shall I bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female, fowls after their kind, cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing on the earth after his kind. 2 of every sort shall come into thee to keep them alive." And then in chapter 7, he said, "Of every clean beast thou shalt take thee by 7s, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female, of fowls, and of all the air by 7s, the male and female, thy seed shall keep upon the face of the earth." So we recognize there is a difference, 2 of everything to keep them alive. And he said 7 of the clean, or 7 pairs of the clean. So why do you think there's a difference between the clean and unclean? Why are there more clean being taken? All right. Do we know that for sure? No, I mean, do we know that's 100% the reason?
Well, there's also the element of after this, they're going to begin to eat animals.
Okay.
Prior to this, they were apparently vegetarian diet, so it may be, obviously, he's not going to let them eat the unclean animals, so they're going to need a little bit extra.
All right. And that's the 2 verses that we have that we see the instructions given, or the narration. When the flood was over and they exited the ark, we see that Noah built the altar unto the Lord and took of every clean beast and every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings. So, as was stated, the clean animals were for sacrifices. So that was used up some right off the bat as soon as they exited. And then it's just mentioned that from what we read, they didn't eat meat before the flood. After the flood, God tells them that the meat shall be or the animals shall be meat for them to eat, just like all the vegetation that they ate beforehand. So, and there is a difference between clean and unclean. But one thing we got to realize is those are probably the right answers, probably the reasons, but it's not stated in a fact that we know 100% that's it. And that's one thing we've got to be careful when we're reading Scripture or teaching Scripture, is that we don't get dogmatic on something that's not 100% revealed. Now, it's good chance those 2 things that were mentioned are the right answers. We do know that God does teach us. He doesn't just always come out and say this is the right answer. Sometimes you get taught through your experiences or what's around you. If you remember in Genesis 2, Adam had to name all the animals of the field to kind of teach him that there wasn't a mate for him yet. And then God put him to sleep, had first surgery, and created Eve. So, he taught him that way. We also have kind of a teaching lesson, the difference between clean and unclean, and started right off the bat, and God's definitely making a point that the clean animals were for the sacrifices, for the eating, and so forth. So it's a big difference. And we see that all through Scripture. There's a difference between evil, between right and wrong. A lot of times we blur that line, but when we look at God's teaching, there's a big line there, and there's a right side and a wrong side. And a lot of times we don't pay attention to that a lot. In Hebrews 12, verse 16, we see Esau's called profane because he sold his birthright. And you can see from the language there, God is really stressing the fact that, he took something that was set aside for him and, kind of threw it to the side, traded it off like it was nothing. And God called him a profane man. In Malachi 1, 7, 8, and 9, God's condemning the Israelites because of some of their sacrifices. They were given imperfect animals. So, he's stressing that he has set these rules, and that's what we need to pay attention to. So, but these are assumptions of why they're the two different sets of animals. They're probably the right assumptions, but, God doesn't give us a 100% answer, and that's just kind of an important thing when we're teaching the Scripture is God gave us the Bible. It's perfect. It's inerrant. And He doesn't need our help adding to it. But those are probably the right answers. So it's just a good teaching lesson that's God had a reason for doing it that way, and that's what we need to recognize. All right, another good question is how did Noah and his family, how did they take care of that many animals? Because it's about a year long that they're all on the ark. And
the Bible doesn't say specifically, but you can surmise. They took stores into the ark, obviously. If you go to the ark in Kentucky, you can see how it could have been. And it shows that it's possible. But the Bible doesn't specifically say how they did it.
right. It's when we look at it, as Mike said, God gives Noah a command that they need to take all the food to be eaten, gather it for these to be food for them and for the animals. So they had to plan for that. They had to plan for how many animals to be able to segregate them accordingly in the ark. And then they had to have the food and segregate it and have their plans. And as Mike said, if you go to the ark encounter, we went. The pictures are terrible. When we went, it was real crowded and it's hard to get pictures. But one thing that I would compliment them on is they had lots of signs that said it could have been this way, or this is one way they might have done it. And I don't have a picture. I had a picture of a cage, but you couldn't see nothing in it. But, they had pots, and they were like clay pots or whatever they would have made at that time. And I forget the material they used for stoppers, but they had automatic waters, similar to what you'd buy at Walmart, just in a bigger scale, and they had automatic feeders, and had stuff where they're not having to go shovel out feed twice a day, and it just showed possibilities. The other, they didn't have enough signs because everybody in our group didn't notice them, but enough of us did. That they did have signs that this is a possibility. So a lot of people have done a lot of studying to help prove that the ark is accurate. God did do it this way, or God commanded it this way. It was done this way, and can be done. This picture I put up here, because you can see it's kind of three plaques or three signs side by side. One of them, they've got a list of all the animals that probably were on the ark. And I'll show you in a minute. Somebody's got a different number, but here they're getting about 6,000, almost 7,000 animals that they've counted here. And then one of the other signs here says everything fits. And you can see on there they've got how much water they would need, how much food, different types of food, how many cages of each size, and the square footage. So everything adds up to fit in a boat that size. So a lot of work's been done to show that it is possible. We don't have exactly how they did it. We got the instructions that God gave Noah, and we know that Noah followed those instructions. But all the in-betweens is a lot of speculation. So that's what we have to be careful with. And this is one of the things I said. They have a lot of signs that it's possible they did it this way. There's other ways that they could have done it. And here they're showing how they could have got rid of waste and fresh air coming in the boat and how to take out the bad air. And it was pretty neat, some of the speculation, and a lot of engineers did a lot of work. This, separate from the Ark Encounter or the Ark Museum, is a book that's written. And I haven't read it, but I was at a lectureship where a guy that did read it and explained how boring the book is. But an engineer did write it and spent a lot of time and explained how 8 people could have built the ark in however many years, and did it in different scenarios. So it could have taken 100 years, could have taken less, and had different time frames and how they could have built it, and went day by day how they could have done it. And then most of it is how they took care of the animals and how they would have done this and how they would have fit them in the ark. So, one thing we've got to make sure of, and the Wednesday night class that we just started, we've got to have confidence in God's Word, not to shy away when somebody starts throwing doubts, or they throw doubts at us. We can't jump on the doubt train and go with them. We've got to understand that it did happen. The Bible is 100% accurate, and that's what we've got to understand. And there are ways to get help to understand and to build that confidence. And that's the only reason I threw these slides up here. Yes?
We need to also remember who was behind this, and it was God. So He will take care of, the animals too, and He could have, some people believe that they could have gone to hibernation too, and especially when it is raining and it's dark. That could have helped them to take care easily of the animals. And it was not just Noah doing it by himself. God was there. His providential hand was there. So we just don't know all the details of what happened. But, we know that God was involved in all the process.
Right. And that was one thing I picked up in Wesley's class Monday night was, too many times we see people say, I believe in Jesus or I'm a Christian, but I doubt the flood. And he said that's impossible to be that way because Jesus believed in the flood. And that's the same thing here, as just was stated, God's involved. So we know it was possible. God's not going to give us a command that we can't do. And there are possibilities. Hibernation is one that a lot of people speculate. So there's all kinds of ways that could have happened, that it could have been done and worked out.
What's interesting about it, especially going to the Ark Encounter, all the planning and all the design, and like I said, God was involved in the putting together the design and the layout. I'm sure Noah didn't have 600 years old, didn't have that much experience having animals put up, water and daily and all that kind of thing. Especially he didn't have experience doing it in a boat.
Right.
And so there's no way you can look at this and leave God out of the picture.
And what's interesting is the Navy actually, they don't have them anymore, but during World War II, they actually built some freighters, I think is what they're called, that basically they built it off the Ark design, the proportionalities, not the exact dimensions, but the proportionalities. They were slow as all get out, but they held a lot more cargo than the normal Navy ships. So there's a lot of interesting aspects to it when you dig into it and go that way. But one thing we do know that is when the flood was over, Noah went forth, his sons, his wife, and sons' wives with him, every beast, every creeping thing, every fowl, whatsoever creepeth on the earth. Basically, everything lived, everything made it through the flood and came out of the ark. So the commands were given, the commands were followed, and it was a success. And that's what we see out of this. And, we're talking about, even if they went into hibernation, they still took food for everybody. So they still had to do work while they were there. And that's what's important for us to realize is we've been put on earth to work. We're not supposed to be lazy creatures here on this earth. In Genesis 2, we see that Adam and Eve were commanded to take care of the garden. That was a job. They had a job to do. They weren't just put there and said, here's paradise, go at it. They were given something to do. And then Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15:58 that we should always be abounding in the work of the Lord. So just as they had a job to do, we've got work to do. And it's our responsibility to learn what that work is and then go do it. It's not hard to find stuff to do. We've just got to recognize it and then actually do it. That's the hard part, is actually doing it. All right. So, of course, the notebook or the notes that came with it jumped straight to dinosaurs. So, and that's everybody's big question is, were dinosaurs on the ark? Were the dinosaurs in the Bible? And the questions go that way. What do we see about the commands, the verses we've already read? What does that tell us to that answer, were dinosaurs on the ark? All right. So we see that. It's every living thing, every sort, every. So there's no exceptions. And then, of course, the same thing with they took them on the ark. The day that they went on the ark and shut the door and the rains came, same thing. Everything was on there that was supposed to be. So, and then the question is, how could they fit on the ark? This would go back to how did they feed them that long and so forth. God was involved. So we know that they had to do some planning. But what are some different possibilities as to how everything would have fit on the ark.
Take babies to start with.
All right? Could have been babies. What do we know about the animals being put on the ark? Did they have to go train some horses and go lasso everything and drag it on? All right, God brought the animals to Noah and helped get them on the ark. So that definitely makes it a possibility that a bunch of babies, and possibly even some of them might have been in the egg stage still. We don't know. Yes?
Speaking about how they fit on the ark, Harry Rimmer offered X number of thousands of dollars for anybody that could prove that the animals wouldn't fit on the ark. Well, they got sued, taken to court. And when the fellow who was suing him presented his case, he said, common sense would tell you all the animals wouldn't fit on the ark because the priest carried the ark across the Jordan River. Two different arks.
Yep, that is true. So we do see that in a lot of arguments. Maybe not that extreme of an example, but we do see that where people are using wrong verses and using it incorrectly. So we got to make sure we understand what we're talking about and let the Bible defend itself. And yes.
God gave the dimensions for the boat. He had this thing figured out before it even started. And then he led the animals, the ones that were going to load the boat, to the boat. So they all fit on the ark because God knew exactly what was going to be on the boat. He designed the boat. He gave the dimensions for the boat. So everything fit on the boat because God said it was going to fit on the boat. Pretty easy.
And he could always have said, we're just going to destroy all the animals and I'll just speak them back into existence when the flood's down. It wasn't like that had to be the way it was done, but it was the way and he wanted it done.
That's right.
On one occasion, Jesus needed to pay his tax money at the temple. And he told Peter to go down to the river there, and lo and behold, there's a fish with the man. Well, when it comes to building the ark, God could have used every animal, elephants, dinosaurs, to help build the ark. Drag the wood, go for wood from who knows where to the building site. God's got it all figured out, like Robbie said.
That's true. Our problem is we don't always listen to God, and that's something we've got to make sure we do is pay attention. And when it comes to a time that we've got to let something go and go God's way, we need to make sure we do that. Do you have something else?
I was just thinking, Philippians 4:19, Paul said, my God shall supply all of your needs. That's something that God has always done for his people. It's not just what God has done in the New Testament age in which we live, but God supplied everything that Noah needed for the building of that ark. He commissioned him to do it, and he helped him do it.
That's right. So we're talking about the dinosaurs. Well, this is how they all could have fit, and we've all answered this, is we have no idea what size animals each species came. When we think about dinosaurs, we think about the biggest ones, and that's it. But most dinosaurs weren't that big. There was a few species that were, but those might have come in an egg. Who knows? Or they might have come as a baby and been pretty small. And then hibernated so that it grows slower. We just don't know. But there's all kinds of answers and possibilities, and there's multiple ways it would have worked. So there's no reason to doubt, what happened. So does the Bible even mention dinosaurs? All right. And what would be a good reason why it's not by that name?
That word wasn't coined until the 19th century.
All right. I left that one in there. There's a bunch of animals that aren't mentioned in the Bible, and we don't ever doubt that they existed. What would be a main reason that we sometimes get intimidated about the fact that dinosaur, that word's not in the Bible?
Evolutionists have latched on to dinosaurs.
All right, evolutionists have latched on. They've got their storyline, and that's what they're pushing. And if you're not with it, you got to stand your ground and be ready to stand your ground. So a lot of times we get intimidated by that factor. But if we look at it, the Bible we'll just round it up, say 100 AD, the Bible was completed. It wasn't translated to English until 1535. Of course, we're all familiar with the King James Version. It was about 1842, and I looked it up to verify the dates and got 2 or 3 dates, but they're all real close. And the majority, or the most popular story, is a doctor and his wife were going to a conference or something, and she found a bone. He did archaeology, whatever that's called, paleontology on the side as a hobby, and found the first dinosaur bone, and that's where the coin got termed, or term got coined, somewhere in that time frame. And basically it's 2 words that mean, fearful giant lizard, or however you want to say it, something big and scary. And, if you look at a T-Rex or some of the different dinosaurs, I'm sure if you were alive when they were, it was probably scary. So it's a fitting term. But that's why we don't see it, especially in the King James Version and some of the older Bibles. Of course, any new translation still is not going to say dinosaur. It sticks to the old words, probably just to avoid fighting. That's a guess. I don't know. But we see that. But when we think about dinosaurs and humans, obviously we've all agreed dinosaurs were on the ark. But how do you prove that dinosaurs and humans existed?
We have evidence of dinosaur footprints next to human footprints.
Okay, we do see those. Even a lot of creation websites or apologetics places, they avoid that argument for some reason.
Well, both were made on the 6th day.
That's right. The scriptures tell us, and there's 3 ways we're going to look at dinosaurs: the Bible itself, what it says, history, and then physical evidence. And when we look at Bible, just as Wesley said, on the 6th day everything was made, or all land animals and man was made. So if dinosaurs existed, and we know they did, they had to be made on the 6th day. So we see that, and then Moses reiterated that in Exodus 20 and said in 6 days God basically made everything. So the dinosaurs were made at that time. Adam and Eve were made at that time. We know people populated, so they had to exist at the same time. When we look at the book of Job, we kind of see an interesting description, and this is where we fall into the translation problem and where people have some disagreements. But, Job did real well putting up with the suffering he was, but he did wear down. He never really blamed God or cursed God, but he definitely was getting to the questioning point. And in chapter 38, God comes to Job in a whirlwind, or talks to him out of a whirlwind. And when he's talking to Job in chapter 38, I guess I need to keep my notes with me. In chapter 38, he's talking about snow, rain, different physical elements that we all understand. And then in chapter 39, he starts talking about wild donkeys and mountain goats and different animals that we also recognize. So we know everything he's talking about is something that exists and Job would recognize. And then people reading the scriptures later would recognize. And then in chapter 40, he brings out a big beast, and he calls it the behemoth, and says, and starts talking about it and describing this animal. And that's how it's described in the book of Job, or in this chapter, as behemoth. And when he goes to describe it, he says, "Behold now the behemoth," and then goes through the descriptions. His strength's in his hips, his powers in the muscles of his belly, moves his tail like a cedar, the sinews of his thighs are tightly knit, his bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs are like bars of iron, the mountains yield food for him where the wild beasts play. If the river is turbulent, he's not frightened, he's confident, though the Jordan rushes through his mouth. And can anyone take him by his eyes or pierce his nose with the snare? He's the chief of the works, or chief of the works of God. So he brings, this huge, I'm calling it a dinosaur, and brings it out and gives a description of him, and basically asks Job the questions, can anyone handle this big animal or this big beast? And a lot of, like if you get a study Bible or most Bibles will have a note on it saying it might be an elephant, might be a hippopotamus, or this or that. But if you look at the descriptions, talking about his tail being a cedar, cedar trees, especially back then, were huge. So neither of those animals that are ever listed could even get close to that description. And if you go through the descriptions, it's obvious it's none of those. And so it's obviously an argument the translators didn't want to deal with. so they left it the word behemoth. But if we look at it, it sounds a lot like the brontosaurus.
Chief in the ways of God, which means the biggest thing.
That's right. And Hollywood makes all these movies. You watch Jurassic Park, and of course that's a big old dinosaur, and the bad ones didn't bother them. They were in this part, and the mean ones were somewhere else. But we see this, and as Mike said, it's the chief of the works of God. So it's huge, takes care of itself. So it's kind of descriptive that way. So we do see that dinosaurs are in the Bible.
Dragons are mentioned in several places.
That's right. And a few slides, we'll get there. Yes, Eddie. That's right. And the very next chapter, he brings out Leviathan, as you said. And he starts to describe him through that chapter. His teeth is terror, his back's made rows of shields, shut up closely, no air can get between them. His sneezing flash forth light, his eyes are like eyelids of dawn. Out of the mouth goes flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes smoke, his breath kindles coals, flame comes from his mouth. In his neck abides strength, his heart's as hard as stone. Though the sword reaches him, it does not avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. And he counts iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. And the arrow cannot make him flee. His underparts are like sharp. And on earth there is no creature like him without fear. So it sounds like a pretty bad animal that never got killed. So it definitely fits some of the descriptions we see in history, and we'll see that in a little bit. But, so we've got two creatures that definitely fit the definition or description of dinosaurs. So we do see the Bible does address it, just not in the terms we were looking for. But, just like I mentioned, wine and drinking last Wednesday night, a lot of times when we read the Bible, we read it from the wrong direction. We don't read it from the person writing it and the language writing it. We read it from the direction of our preconceived ideas. Whereas if we look at it from God's direction, and Moses writing this book, his direction, or who wrote Job, that direction, that's a dinosaur, or that's two dinosaurs. And we know it's not a figurative, mythic creature being described there, because the chapters, the context it's in the middle of, everything else is something physical that we know of. And then these are right there, and it was like God putting an exclamation point on his point to Job.
Joey, I've gone round and round with a preacher in Middle Tennessee. He says the dinosaurs were destroyed in the flood, with which I agree. He said, though, none were on the ark. And I said, that's an impossibility. If they were destroyed in the flood, and if they were creatures that breathed through their nostrils the breath of life, then two of them had to be on the ark. God said so. But I can't get him to see that.
I've got my opinions why some people go that route, and sometimes I think it's they don't want to fight science, or some of the science we have today. They don't want to go down that path. I don't know why some people will go that route. And just as Wesley said Monday, how do you proclaim to believe the Bible, proclaim to believe Jesus, but you can't believe something he believes? And that's what we've got to be careful of, and we've got to have confidence in that. Is it wrong to question, we're leaving here and going into history and evidence of dinosaurs and man. Is it wrong to look at outside sources to help prove a topic or a point in the Scriptures? All right, Paul done it in Acts chapter 17. Started as basically he stayed out of the Bible for his sermon, with the exception of mentioning God. So you've got to start where your audience is, and bring them to God and bring them to the Scripture. That's true. So nature is a good place to start. And as Mike mentioned, the word dragon and actually fiery flying serpent, sea monsters, different words are in Scripture. And they didn't have a term like we have, of the specific animal or beast or whatever they were trying to describe. So we know things survived after the flood, and people saw them, and they were written, and we see them in the Scripture. You know, so we've got confidence that man and dinosaurs did live at one time. Sometimes, maybe it's the fact of you watch a movie like Jurassic Park, think there's no way man lived when them things were on the earth. But, you know, at the same time, I might like to hunt, but if you put me in Africa, something's going to eat me. You know, I don't know how to survive in that environment, you know. So we can't start guessing everything in all these different scenarios. People did live at the same time. When we look at history of dinosaurs, or the history of the earth, or history of man, and how we teach history or look at it, you know, we've already mentioned the word dinosaur didn't exist up until the 1840s. Before then, everything was called a dragon. Didn't matter what it was. So that was a popular word. But there are a lot of stories about dragons. And if you go through all the stories and some of the drawings, they didn't all look like what Hollywood calls a dragon. Some of them did, but some of them didn't. And basically they all fit all these different kind of dinosaurs that we make today. But when we look at Chinese parades, or even in America, and a Chinese group is in the parade, this is what they call a dragon. And they are still adamant about this. But us as Americans normally don't think too much about it. But we all recognize Marco Polo. And he wrote a big old book, and I hadn't read hardly any of it, just enough to use it. But we all believe everything he wrote except for one chapter. And in that chapter, 49, he actually got taken on a tour and saw where they had killed a dragon just like the one in the slide before. And he describes them. Some of them are up to 50 foot long, 100 inches in diameter. So they were big creatures and actually had two little bitty legs that they helped crawl. And he even talks here, nobody would approach them without terror. So they couldn't just go up and fight them. And what they did is actually set traps for them. These things were so big, they always used the same path and had a indention in the ground where they slithered through or crawled through. So they would set a trap, and basically it would kill itself. And then they would come and finish the job off. So
I knew about this, but I've never read that. Back to that screen you had before, he pretty much described the T-Rex. At the forepart near the head, they have two short legs, each with 3 claws. You know, they talked about T-Rex as short. They don't know what he did with them. They were
right.
short and useless.
Yeah, so I mean, so we see the descriptions. And then Josephus, and I never knew this was in Josephus. But, you know, we use his book a lot because Jesus is described in there, John the Baptist is in there. But part of the antiquities of the Jews, he's talking about Moses and the Exodus out of Egypt. And the red part I put on this page. But, you know, it's not an inspired book, so is it true or not, or is it just like the other stories? You know, that's how we have to take, but it is an account. And when they left, he says at one point, instead of going and fighting, they took another path to avoid fighting, I think, the Ethiopians. But he knew that path had these flying serpents. He calls them multiple serpents that flew in the air. So what Moses did is took these birds called ibis from Egypt. They had them in baskets while they were traveling. And when they got to that one pass where these flying serpents were, they released the ibis, and the ibis ran the serpents off. And and he compliments Moses being a great military leader and had that plan and so forth. But what's interesting as far as Josephus mentioning it and calling the birds by name the ibis is Pliny, who wrote a lot of history. He talks about birds that were called ibis, and he even says that the Egyptians used those or invoked those against the serpents. So he's got the same story that Josephus had. And then Herodotus, who I think he's titled the father of modern history or historians, but he wrote about a place in Arabia that had serpents with wings that flew, and he went to go see them and talked about just how many bones there were. You know, I guess they collected the bones as they killed them. And he talked about the wings didn't have feathers and so forth, which would match a lot of dragon stories that we see and the different legends of that way. So we see lots of accounts. This one I thought was real neat. That's actually a drawing. It's not I guess somebody had this sitting in their castle or something. There supposedly was a flying dragon in Rome as late as 1691. It's in the wetlands near Rome. It's got the name of this guy. His last name's Meyer. I can't pronounce the other two words. But he had this drawing, and they described the skeleton so much that it still had skin on the neck close to the head, so they knew it wasn't a fossil. The wings still had some structure to them. All the bones, he had the fist, the different fingers on his feet. And it's real descriptive of what we see in movies and Hollywood. And I just bring this up to get to a final point. But so we all see movies of dragons. They all kind of fit this picture or this description. And there's tons of tales. I had to cut stuff out, just for time. But there's tons of tales that match this one as far as, and they'll have names of this guy killed this dragon and so forth. And so Hollywood definitely, they made a movie called Beowulf, and it's I think it was an English poem. And anyway, Beowulf's the hero. He kills some monster. The monster had a name, Grendel. Then he killed his mom, then he became king. Years later, there was a dragon that started harassing him, and he went to go kill the dragon and was successful, but was mortally wounded and died. But, so it's got all the different aspects of dinosaurs and people killing them and fighting. So Hollywood latches on, makes a movie. And, of course, we see other movies. This one, I think, is that's Dragon Slayer. And then we've got Dragon Heart. And all the dinosaurs, and, of course, as technology improves over the years, they get better looking or scarier looking. But they all kind of fit the same main look. And they all fly the same. They all breathe fire, blah, blah, blah. But the reason I brought this up, that we all like to watch the movies, and we don't have a problem believing old legends or saying they were legends. But then this guy came along. I don't even know if I wrote his name down. Dracorex Hogwarts something. They used Harry Potter as the second name, but the first part of the name is Dracorex. And that's the actual fossil they got sitting at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. And it's interesting. They still have a title that says it's a new type of dinosaur that looks like a dragon. But they do a lot of explaining that it's not a dragon, it's just a dinosaur. And National Geographic even did an article on it, but never mentioned the word dragon. They didn't even say it looked like a dragon. They just talked about it being, a scary-looking dinosaur. And what was interesting is I used this in a class years ago, and this was found in 2003. It was a big unveiling, so it was just a year or two after. And when they did the unveiling, one of the archaeologists was there, and he was making a big deal out of it looking just like a dragon we see on movies and different legends, and it was like a 10-minute speech. And I saved the link to that, and it wasn't 6 months, a year later, and that video does not exist. And my theory is there were several creation websites and apologetic websites that said, see, these guys know dragons existed, and would use the guy's own words. And now those words don't exist, and the museum does a lot of explaining, saying it's not a dragon, it's a dinosaur. So, we know, and you can quote all kinds of atheists, and they'll all admit, if you ever prove dinosaurs and man lived together, evolution's out the window. So they do everything they can to say that man and dinosaurs didn't live at the same time. So if you have a dragon that shows up, and you've got all these legends, and people have been killing dragons before they all died away, there goes their theory of evolution. So that's why I brought up movies and how we all accepted it up to a certain point, and then all of a sudden, they didn't exist. So I thought that was pretty interesting. As far as physical evidence, we've got a temple in Cambodia, and it's a huge temple. But one of the entrances there where that arrow is showing, in that corner there's a lot of carvings of different creatures, animals, and all of them are recognizable, and even this one that we assume is a stegosaurus, but it's a dinosaur. And it's in the middle of lions, monkeys, and different things that they carve for decoration. And we see that, at that temple. And then the ACAMBARO stones, I think somebody here's mentioned it a few weeks ago. But this one doctor got one as a gift, and it wasn't too big, but it was like a paperweight, and he had it on his desk, so he started searching them out, trying to find out about them. I think he ended up with 1,100 of them. And they turned out they're burial stones that they would put on a tomb or where they would bury someone, and that's kind of what we use as markers. That would be a marker. But as you look at them, they're obviously carvings or engravings of dinosaurs. So what's unique about all these drawings? If they, got it sketched in or carved into a temple, then you got burial stones, and the one before it, there's actually somebody fighting a dinosaur. So what does that tell us as far as this being physical evidence, or calling it physical evidence?
Well, they were accurate before the skeletons, for the most part, were ever dug up.
That's right. If you look at the dates on these, that temple was built 1186. The bones didn't come around until 1840s, we mentioned a while ago. So that's several hundred years. And they've got accurate drawings, accurate carvings. Yes?
Well, T-Rex was supposed to have disappeared 65 million years ago. But they have found fossils with viable tissue in America. And that can't be 65 million years ago. There's just no way. I'm talking about viable DNA.
Yep. Yeah, and that's a good point. And that's the point they avoid.
With man's sandals footprints right alongside as if it were hunting.
Yeah, in Texas, there's a riverbed that actually has, and that's what it does look like. One of them was hunting the other one. So there are plenty of evidences, and as Wesley's saying, the depictions are too accurate for them to do it, and they had no skeletons like we have. So they had to have been face to face to see them, or yes.
Just like the one that drew the picture of George Washington, all our early fathers of the country, they saw them, and that's how they got the picture. And then those who drew the pictures of the dinosaurs had to see them to know what they looked like. They're on rock or sideboard.
That's right.
Rock wall.
And these are probably my favorite. And these are little figurines, and of course we recognize them as dinosaurs. And some are more accurate than others, but they're obviously dinosaurs. And these, it wasn't too long ago when they were found, but the area that they were found in, some of the other artifacts that they found at the same time, they were dating those artifacts around 800 BC to 200 AD. So that was a guess. So they decided to do some of the dating methods. And the first go around, they came up with 1640 BC, 4500 BC, 1100 BC. Of course, that was somebody cooperating with them. So they decided to send it to a university that could do carbon dating. And they were smart enough to know that they weren't going to cooperate. I think it was even University of Pennsylvania. So what they did, I don't know whether you call this honest or not, they would like cut a leg off and make sure it didn't look like a leg, and just sent part of it and said, hey, we found this in a pile of junk. Can you date it for us? And they sent a few pieces like that, and they came up with 2500 BC. And it was kind of left alone until they started writing papers about it. And then all of a sudden, University of Pennsylvania said, oh, our equipment messed up. That's not accurate. So we can see, and we all understand that game goes on when we're talking about evolution and creation and the Bible. So that's kind of why that's my favorite. But if you go back to Marco Polo and his description of the dinosaur, that dragon, this here is almost like a snake with two legs. So it almost fits the Marco Polo description. So we have to wonder. You can't know for sure because everything was so long ago. But those are... yeah. Yep. So it's just like if somebody's up here preaching and they, well, I'll use Eddie for an example. When he came and did the youth thing in Abington and didn't have a Bible, so he wanted to borrow one, and we're like, he didn't open it the whole time, but he was comfortable having the Bible in his hand. But he quoted so many verses during that devotional, But what does that say about the verses he quoted? Somebody wrote those verses. He was basically verbally copying those verses. And just as you mentioned, they were visually copying what they saw. And it's the same thing. So that's why these are considered physical evidence, because somebody had to see them. They couldn't just dream these up, and then all of a sudden these bones showed up, hundreds of years later. Yes?
I was born, I was raised about 4 hours from that place. And 10 years ago, I was able to go to that place in Ica, no, in Mexico, the previous Ica.
Oh, okay, yes.
So I went there and I met the daughter of the Dr. Cabrera, the one that just got all these stones, who is already dead, and people just consider him like crazy because of what he did, trying to get all this stuff, and he came out with theories. He just got crazy himself too because he didn't want to take the obvious implication.
Right.
So he came out with ideas of just UFOs or something like that. Anyway, but I went to his museum, which is kind of abandoned. Nobody recognized those stones. They don't want to do it. But I went to a place where the wife of the man who gave the stone to him as a gift, the worker, and I asked if there were more stones. And actually, we went to a place, and of course they didn't have any stones at that time.
Right.
But I told them, if you dig, I'll buy it for you. Well, they called me about a week later, and they have found a few. So I bought some of them. I even brought it here to the U.S. I would have loved to bring one of them here. But anyway, you can bring it because they are not recognized.
Right.
They just, they think it's fake, but they are not. I mean, they describe the dinosaurs very, very unique way before scientists understood how they looked. Yet they depict very well. And then science realized that, for example, the scales.
Right.
They were outside, and instead of inside, you see those things in the pictures. So it's very interesting, those stones.
It is, and sometimes you might say it's not obvious because they try and hide it from us, but if you look, the evidence, it does become obvious. There's lots of it there for us to see and find. The Natural Bridges Monument in Utah, has paintings, inside of caves that the Indians or whatever we want to describe them as, painted on there. That one's obviously a dinosaur. You can see a man in the other one. And there's other animals in the same cave that we recognize them as animals that still exist. Black Dragon Canyon actually has a dragon painted on it. This one, you can't tell it from the picture, is actually 7 foot long, that they painted on the wall. And you can see it's breathing fire, just like some of the descriptions that we've seen in other stories and so forth. So the physical evidence, it abounds. And the one in Utah, it got visited by a lot of evolutionists that would look at it, and they would come up with ways to try and explain the dinosaur aspect away. But none of them ever said that it wasn't a legitimate painting on the wall. It was the same age as all the other paintings. None of them ever tried to argue that. So we see the evidence still hangs right in front of us.
Joy, the evolutionists must live and die by the geological columns. And the only place the geological columns are found is in textbooks and in the minds of evolutionists. They're not found anywhere else upon the face of the earth. That's
right. And even in their textbooks, their geological columns, there's trees that are petrified through all the different columns, you know, and they try and talk those away.
There are animal fossils. We one was a whale that was vertical through the strata. And the front end of the whale was something like 20 million years older than the back end. So I don't know if it was an extremely slow birth or a really slow death.
Took it a long time to run.
That's remarkable.
And Eddie mentioned it a while ago. They found soft dinosaur tissue, or found skeletons that still had tissue in it, and they could get DNA out of it. This picture just shows an electron microscope or micrograph of it, where they're actually stretching the tissue. So it's not even petrified tissue. It's still squishy and pullable, and I don't know if that's a word. I made one up. But, you know, it's still movable tissue. So the likelihood that it's 65 million years old just goes out the window because of the condition of the soft tissue. So what did happen to the dinosaurs? Is they come off the ark, and, you know, one preacher has a hard time saying they were on the ark and came off the ark. So why do we still have lions and tigers and elephants but no dinosaurs? All right, climate change, everybody's favorite word these days.
Reptiles continue to grow as they get older. Before the flood, there was a canopy around the earth of water that caused men even to live to be 900 years old. When that canopy fell, those dinosaurs didn't get as big as they once did. And so eventually they died out for whatever reason.
All right. So the change in climate, change in environment, that is probably the main reason. And I think Chris is going to address a lot of this tomorrow as far as the conditions of the earth during, before, after the flood, and so forth. And as Wesley mentioned, you know, an extra canopy, and that's where some of the massive rains came from, you know, when that let loose, and then the environment and the oceans, you know, waters of the deep came up. So we had volcanoes, the temperature changed, and I tried to find it in the video. I couldn't find the video I watched before, where they actually explained the science and had calculations of how the Ice Age followed the flood, and how the different aspects of that, and maybe you'll have that tomorrow, I don't know. But, okay, no. But you know, that was the cause of the Ice Age, and then, of course, it, you know, didn't stay. The huge Ice Age kind of went back some, but that probably played a huge part in it. And, you know, Wesley talking about that canopy, there's a creation museum in Texas, and that individual actually got a dive chamber and turned it into a tropical forest, and, you know, did some calculations. So there's some assumptions involved, but created what he would thought the Garden of Eden or the world was before the flood. And they actually grow insects a lot bigger than they grow outside that environment. And Wayne Jackson has written about the tar pits in California, and where all these different skeletons are mixed up and mixed together. But, you know, he talks about there's some skeletons of dragonflies that were 17 inches long. You know, so it definitely was a different environment prior to the flood. So, you know, there's a different environment when they came off the flood. They didn't all just die immediately, because we have all these stories, legends, people saw them and made, you know, the burial stones and all these. So they did last for a while, but not to the point of man and dinosaurs didn't live together. So that's one aspect. Another aspect that they might have been hunted into extinction. We looked at it a while ago that God gave them animals for food after the flood. The end of that, he says, every living thing shall be meat for you, even as the green herb I've given you all things. So that gives us an idea they didn't eat meat before the flood, but they did after the flood. So then people started hunting and eating animals. So that would, you know, so if you had a village to feed and you had a T-Rex over there and had a way of killing him, that was a lot easier than killing 20 cows, you know, or something. So that's right. They didn't have to tag them, so they could just. But so that's one aspect. But we do have description of different people. You know, a lot of times evolutionists like to talk about cavemen being dumb, and it took so long before man could do things. But Nimrod's described as a mighty hunter. It even says a mighty hunter before the Lord. And then we get into David and Goliath. So we know we had, big giants that were real good at fighting. He's described as a mighty man. Caleb had to kill some giants. So we know we had mighty men. If you look at the mighty men that were fought for David, those guys were described pretty scary dudes. One guy saw a lion in a pit, jumped in and killed it. And they describe these guys, and he goes, but he's not as good as this one. And there's like 33 mighty men that had some pretty descriptive characteristics. So good chance they got hunted. That was probably a good trophy on the wall. So that's one aspect. But, do we know the exact reason they disappeared? No, we don't. Doubt it was an asteroid that put us in an ice age and killed dinosaurs only, and everybody else came back. I don't.
None exist now, doesn't prove that none ever existed.
That's right.
So it's a bogus argument.
And Jeff Miller, he does a thing on animals and extinction, and gets into the definition of kinds of animals, species of animals, the difference. But he goes to explain how many species they're adding every year. We're still adding and discovering species of animals and insects. But then he talks about how many species have gone extinct since we started recording animals. And I never dreamed there was that many animals that went extinct. But the only thing we care about is dinosaurs. But when you actually look at the list and how many there are, there's tons of animals and insects and different things that have gone extinct since we've been on this planet. So when we look at the applications, and when I was going through the notes they provided for this class, kind of shook my head because I used every one of these verses in the class going through that book. So I don't know if I just borrowed them all when I wrote the book. I don't know. But 2 Peter 1:3, God's given us everything that we need pertains to life and godliness. So the questions that we have, what happened to the dinosaurs? How to get them on the ark? The Bible's not a history book, but there is factual history included in the Bible. But we're given what we need to know, and that's what we've got to remember. And we need to make sure we stay within the confines of what God's written also. He doesn't need our help trying to say what actually happened. We can speculate and definitely use outside sources to prove that there's not contradictions in the Bible. We can do that. But if there's a possibility that we've got an answer, then we know the Bible's not wrong. Or we can prove that aspect that it's not wrong. All Scripture's inspired of God. We talked about that. So we know that if they all fit on the ark, we know they were on there. Or if we're told they were on the ark, we know they were on there. Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong to God, but what He's revealed to us is what we're allowed to have, or what we can know and be confident in knowing. So the things He didn't tell us, we don't need to know. He's given us what we need to know. And then here, His ways are higher than our ways, His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Sometimes we want to know these answers, and the reason for wanting to know it is just curiosity. It's not necessarily an answer we need to know. And God had a plan. Why exactly were there 7 pairs of clean animals? We got 2 pretty good assumptions, and they're probably close to right or are right. But, God had a plan. That's all we need to know. And Noah followed that plan, and Noah, saved himself and his family. And is a good example for us. So, that's the lesson we need to learn from that. He's not going to ask us to do anything that we can't do. And that's one thing is, seeing an ark, especially if you go to the Ark Museum in Kentucky, that is a big boat. And it's hard to imagine, 8 people, 3 sons and a dad building that boat. But they did it. But the earth and man was different before the flood, so who knows how big and strong they were, who knows how big the trees were. And they had lots of time to do it. But here it says, God tells us we're not going to be tempted above what we're able to do. There's always a way of escape. There's lots of verses where God emphasizes flee fornication, flee this, flee that. Sometimes the escape is that temptation's in front of you. You just need to find a door and leave. But God's never going to put something in front of us that we can't do and be faithful to Him. So that's important for us to realize. And Philippians 2:13 says, "For it is God which worketh in you both to His will, or to will and to do His good pleasure." So God does work with us, and I think Mosiah said that. God was with Noah when they built the inside of the ark, set everything up, got the food ready. God was with him, and God will be with us when we do face challenges and when we do stuff. And just as Paul said, we need to always be abounding in the work. When we look at God's word and us in our Christian walk, it's a growing process. So we're always going to run into somebody that is going to challenge us, and we may not have the right answer, but you can always find somebody to help you. But having that confidence in God's word, you never shy away from the challenge. You sit down and find the right answer, and that's what's important. And one thing I've learned is when you get hit with that challenge and you got to get help or it takes time to learn it, that sticks with you a lot longer than just sitting down and memorizing some verses. When you have that challenge and you've got to overcome it that way. And that is the end of my notes. That time pretty good. So, anybody got any questions or comments? Or?
Just on the last point there, I failed it with my own, and I'll just go ahead into confession time here. Oftentimes when those challenges come up, because we have this pride, there's nothing else you can describe it as. I'm supposed to be a strong man, all that stuff. So I will try to work on that challenge with my own strength until finally I realize I don't have what it takes, and then I'll turn to His strength. And I've got it completely backwards when I do that. And I have enough examples of having done it both ways where I try to do it myself and I make such a mess of it, then He's going to help me clean it up. Versus the other times when I immediately turn and over and over and over again, I'm reminded that if I just hand it to Him to start with, then I can avoid all of the spinning of my wheels. So,
That's a good point. We need to make sure we're walking with Him and not in front of Him. That's anybody else? I guess we can grab some snacks before the kids get here.
Thank you, Joy. It's good.
All right. Thank y'all.